Hello, and welcome to our video on smooth muscle tissue. In this presentation, we will learn about the location of smooth muscle tissue, the anatomical characteristics of smooth muscle tissue, and the functional characteristics of smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle is named for the fact that it has no striations, for a reason to be described shortly. If myocytes are relatively small, allowing for fine control of such tissues and organs as a single hair in the dermis of the skin through the erection of the erector pili muscles used for thermoregulation or when feeling scared, it can consist of as little as one cell in small arteries or surrounding the bronchioles in the lungs. By dilating or constricting the blood vessels and airway, it can modify the speed of air and blood flow, maintain blood pressure, and reroute blood from one pathway to another. Smooth muscle can propel the contents of an organ, such as driving food through the digestive tract, voiding urine and feces, transporting gametes, and expelling the infant at childbirth. In this figure of a cross-section through the esophagus, you can see the smooth muscle tissues in the outer structures colored in red. The esophagus and intestines have an outer layer of longitudinal smooth muscle adjacent to a deeper inner layer of circular muscle. When the longitudinal layer contracts, it shortens and dilates the organ. When the circular layer contracts, it constricts and lengthens the organ. In the stomach, urinary bladder, and uterus, smooth muscle forms 3 or more layers with bundles of myocytes running in multiple directions. Smooth muscle myocytes have a long, slender spindle shape, typically about 5 to 10 microns wide at the middle, tapering to a point at each end, and usually ranging from 30 to 200 microns long, but up to 500 microns long in the pregnant uterus. They are enclosed in endomysium but have no perimysium, fascicles, or epimysium. There is only one nucleus located near the middle of the cell. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is scanty, and there are no T-tubules. Thick and thin filaments are present, but there are no striations, sarcomeres, or myofibrils because the myofilaments are not bundled and aligned with each other the way they are in striated muscles. Z-discs are absent. In their place are protein plaques called dense bodies, some adhering to the interface of the plasma membrane and others dispersed throughout the sarcoplasm. The membrane-associated dense bodies of one cell are often directly across from those of another, with linkages between them so that contractile force can be transmitted from cell to cell. Associated with the dense bodies is an extensive cytoskeletal network of intermediate filaments. Actin filaments attach to the intermediate filaments as well as directly to the dense bodies, so their movement, powered by myosin, is transferred to the sarcolemma and shortens the cell. Unlike skeletal muscle, there are no tendons or aponeuroses. Smooth muscle differs from other muscle tissue in several ways. Excitation-contraction coupling, length-tension relationships, types of smooth muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tone. We will review each of these concepts in the following slides. Whereas skeletal muscle contracts only in response to excitatory stimulation by a somatic motor fiber, smooth muscle can be stimulated in a multitude of ways. Some stimuli excite the myocyte, and others inhibit it. Some produce action potentials in the sarcolemma, particularly in unitary smooth muscle, whereas others stimulate the myocyte by non-electrical means. Some smooth muscle has no nerve supply at all. Modes of smooth muscle stimulation and some examples include the following. Autonomic nerve fibers and neurotransmitters. For example, parasympathetic nerves secrete acetylcholine and stimulate gastrointestinal mobility. Sympathetic nerves secrete norepinephrine and dilate the bronchioles of the lungs. Chemicals. Smooth muscle reacts to hormones, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitric acid, low pH, and other chemical stimuli. The hormone oxytocin, for example, stimulates the labor contractions of the uterus, and histamine relaxes the smooth muscles of the arteries. Temperature. Cold induces contraction of smooth muscle, resulting in erection of the hairs and tautening of the skin in such regions as the areola and the scrotum, whereas warmth relaxes smooth muscle in arteries of the skin. Stretch. The stomach and urinary bladder contract when stretched by food or urine. Lastly, autorhythmicity. Some unitary smooth muscle is autorhythmic, especially in the stomach and intestines. Some myocytes spontaneously depolarize at regular time intervals and set off waves of contraction throughout an entire layer of muscle. Rhythmic cycles of activity are controlled by specialized cells called pace-setter cells. There are also pacemaker cells in the heart. However, due to the different functions of the other organs, the pace of the smooth muscle tissue is much slower than the cardiac muscle tissue contractions. Calcium ions are the immediate trigger for contraction, but unlike skeletal and cardiac muscle, smooth muscle has no troponin to bind it. Calcium binds instead to a similar protein called calmodulin 14, associated with myosin. Calmodulin then activates an enzyme called myosin light chain kinase, which adds a phosphate group to a small regulatory protein on the myosin head. This activates the myosin ATPase, enabling it to bind to actin and hydrolyze ATP. The myosin then produces repetitive power and recovery strokes like those of skeletal muscle. As thick filaments pull on the thin ones, the thin filaments pull on the dense bodies and membrane plaques. Through the dense bodies and cytoskeleton, force is transferred to the plasma membrane and the entire cell shortens. When a smooth muscle cell contracts, it puckers and twists, somewhat like wringing out a towel. Remember, skeletal muscle cannot contract very forcefully if it is overstretched. Smooth muscle, however, is less limited by the length-tension relationship. It contracts forcefully even when greatly stretched, so hollow organs such as the stomach and bladder can fill and then expel their contents efficiently. Skeletal muscle must be within 30% of optimum length in order to contract strongly when stimulated. Smooth muscle, by contrast, can be anywhere from half to twice its resting length and still contract powerfully. There are 3 reasons for this. 1. There are no Z-discs, so thick filaments cannot butt against them and stop the contraction. 2. Since the thick and thin filaments are not arranged in orderly sarcomeres, stretching of the muscle doesn't cause a situation in which there is too little overlap for cross bridges to form. And 3. The thick filaments of smooth muscle have myosin heads along their entire length. There's no bare zone, so cross bridges can form anywhere, not just at the ends. Smooth muscle also exhibits plasticity, the ability to adjust its tension to the degree of stretch. Thus, a hollow organ such as the bladder can be greatly stretched, yet not become flabby when it's empty. Smooth muscle tissue shows a range of types between 2 extremes called multi-unit and unitary types. Multi-unit smooth muscle occurs in some of the largest arteries and pulmonary air passages, erector muscles of the hair follicles, and eye muscles that control the iris and the lens. Its innervation, although autonomic, is to some degree similar to that of the skeletal muscle. The terminal branches of a nerve fiber synapse with individual myocytes and form a motor unit. Each cell may be connected to more than one motor neuron, hence the name multi-unit. Multi-unit smooth muscle does not, however, generate action potentials. It contracts in response to variable, graded, electrical changes in the sarcolemma or even in the absence of electrical excitation. Unitary, single unit, smooth muscle is more common. It occurs in most blood vessels and in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Therefore, it's also called visceral muscle. This type forms the aforementioned layers in many of the hollow viscera. The names unitary and single unit refer to the fact that myocytes of this type of muscle are electrically coupled together by gap junctions. This allows them to directly stimulate each other, so numerous cells contract as a unit, almost as if they were a single cell. In this muscle type, the nerve varicosities are not associated with a specific myocyte, but stimulate several of them at once when they release neurotransmitter. Smooth muscle often exhibits tetanus and is very resistant to fatigue. It makes most of its ATP aerobically, but its ATP requirement is small and has relatively few mitochondria. Skeletal muscle requires 10 to 300 times as much ATP as smooth muscle to maintain the same amount of tension. The fatigue resistance and latch bridge mechanism of smooth muscles are important in enabling it to maintain a state of continual tonic contraction called smooth muscle tone. Smooth muscle tone is controlled by neural, hormonal, or chemical factors. An example of smooth muscle tone is that it keeps the arteries in a state of partial constriction, called vasomotor tone. A widespread loss of muscle tone in the arteries can cause a dangerous drop in blood pressure. Smooth muscle tone also keeps the intestines partially contracted. The intestines are much longer in a cadaver than they are in a living person because of the loss of muscle tone at death. In summary, smooth muscle tissue is located in the integumentary, digestive, respiratory, cardiovascular, urinary, and reproductive systems. It is made up of long, slender, spindle-shaped cells with a single, central nucleus. It can be stimulated through the autonomic nervous system and changes in chemicals, temperature, and stretch, and has autorhythmicity. Contraction of smooth muscle tissue is mediated when calcium ions bind to the protein calmodulin. It has the property of plasticity and is able to stretch and recoil to great sizes. Smooth muscle tissue has two different types of tissue, multi-unit and single-unit, or unitary smooth cells that can be innervated individually or by multiple motor neurons, respectively. Lastly, smooth muscle tone is resistant to fatigue and keeps some tissues partially contracted, such as in our intestines and arteries. Thanks.